In the quiet town of Evergreen, life had always followed a predictable rhythm. Nestled deep in a valley, the town was surrounded by thick forests and mountains that shielded it from the chaos of the outside world. Evergreen was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were whispered but rarely kept. But as the sun set on October 31st, the townspeople noticed something strange. The sun did not rise the next day or the next. Evergreen had fallen into an endless night, and with it came a terror that none of them could have imagined. At first, the townspeople were confused. Clocks ticked past the usual dawn, but the sky remained a deep, impenetrable black. Phones were useless as communication with the outside world was cut off. Electricity flickered, then failed, plunging the town into a darkness deeper than any blackout. Panic set in. Was this some kind of natural disaster? A government experiment gone wrong? No one knew. As the hours passed, people began to see things. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Whispers filled the air, too quiet to understand but too loud to ignore. Old fears, long buried, began to resurface in the minds of the townsfolk. The darkness seemed to be alive, feeding off their anxieties and growing stronger with each passing hour. By the third day, though no one could be sure how much time had really passed, Evergreen was in chaos. People who had always been friendly neighbors turned on each other, driven mad by the endless night. In the absence of light, their minds played tricks on them. They saw monstrous versions of themselves and their loved ones, twisted by fear and darkness. But it wasn't just their minds. The town itself began to change. Streets stretched and twisted, leading to places that didn't exist before. Houses became labyrinthine, trapping their occupants in endless loops of hallways and doors that led to nowhere. And the whispers, they grew louder, more insistent, as if something in the darkness was calling to them. Among the first to disappear were the children. Parents woke to find empty beds and open windows, the cold night air filling rooms that should have been warm and safe. Search parties were organized, but the dark streets and shifting landscape made it impossible to find anyone. Some claimed to hear the laughter of children coming from the woods, but those who ventured out rarely returned. Those who did came back changed, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and refusing to speak of what they had seen. As more children vanished, a sense of dread settled over the town. Old stories were whispered again, stories of a time long ago when the valley was cursed by a vengeful spirit, one that thrived in the darkness and fed on the fear of the living. But those were just legends, weren't they? As the night stretched into what felt like weeks, the dead began to return. At first, it was just glimpses, shadows on the edge of vision, familiar faces in the crowd. But soon they became more substantial. The deceased walked the streets of Evergreen, pale and silent, their eyes filled with a sorrow that was almost unbearable to look at. The townspeople were confronted by the ghosts of their past. Loved ones lost, mistakes made, sins that could never be forgiven. The dead were not vengeful, but their presence was a constant reminder of the guilt and grief that had been buried with them. Some residents tried to apologize, to make amends, but the ghosts never responded. They simply stood and watched, their presence a silent condemnation. The town's only hope seemed to lie in the old church at the center of Evergreen. Father Matthias, the town's priest, claimed to have found something in the ancient texts stored in the church's basement, something that might explain what was happening. A group of townspeople gathered there, desperate for answers. Father Matthias revealed that Evergreen was built on cursed land, a place where a terrible atrocity had been committed centuries ago. A coven of witches had been executed here, their deaths slow and agonizing. With their dying breath, they had cursed the land, vowing that one day the night would come for those who had wronged them. And now that time had come. The only way to lift the curse, Father Matthias explained, was to find the witches' graves and perform a ritual of atonement. But the graves were lost, their location forgotten over the centuries. The townspeople would have to search the ever-changing landscape, facing their deepest fears along the way. The search for the graves was harrowing. The landscape of Evergreen had become a twisted reflection of the townspeople's worst nightmares. Streets led into vast forests that shouldn't have existed, where the trees whispered dark secrets. Buildings crumbled into ruins as soon as they were entered, trapping those inside in endless cycles of horror. But eventually, the graves were found, deep in the heart of the forest where the whispers were loudest. The witches had been buried in a mass grave, their bones twisted together in a final act of defiance. The townspeople, led by Father Matthias, began the ritual, their voices shaking as they recited the ancient words. As the ritual progressed, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides. The whispers became screams, filled with rage and pain. The ground trembled as the spirits of the witches rose, their forms barely visible in the blackness. But the townspeople continued, their voices growing stronger as they faced their fears head-on. Just as it seemed the darkness would consume them all, the ritual reached its climax. With a final desperate plea for forgiveness, Father Matthias cast the offering into the grave. There was a moment of silence, followed by a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the sun was rising over Evergreen. The night had finally ended. The town was in ruins and many lives had been lost, but those who survived knew they had been given a second chance. The dead had returned to their rest, and the living began to rebuild. The curse had been lifted, but the scars would remain, both on the town and on the souls of those who had endured the endless night. Years later, Evergreen seemed to have returned to normal, but on the anniversary of that fateful night, the sun always seemed to set just a little earlier, the shadows a little darker. And if you listened closely, you could still hear the whispers in the wind, reminding the town of the darkness that had once almost consumed them all.